Hello everyone, I'm Quinn Buckland, author of The Engine What Runs the World, Fallen Gods, The 1099th, and Supernatural Pizza. And soon enough, Dead Man Walking, which is not released yet, and I don't have a physical copy of it, so I can't show it here. But it's an upcoming book. September 29th, actually. Might actually be out by the time I release this video. Yeah, I think it might be. Anyway, it's released at this point, we'll say. Anyway, what do all these books have in common? They all take place within the same world, in the same universe that I have called the Writerverse. Why is it called the Writerverse? What is this world? Well, I'm about to get into that. Woo! What is the Writerverse? The Writerverse is basically the universe in which that I'm writing in, obviously. But what does it come from? Where does the name come from? Basically, it comes from a moment in time when the student, a character of absolute power, which I will get into a little later, basically goes up and talks with the writer, myself. The whole thing was basically just me talking to myself for the most part. But the student takes what he knows, goes back to Earth, and basically creates a book detailing what he knows about the writer, about the universe, about it, all this stuff. And it sort of becomes this ultimate religion. And it's the sort of religion that carries over like 2,000, 3,000, however many years. It basically becomes one of the biggest religions that this world ever knows. In fact, it ends up spanning several galaxies. And with that, people start to worship this entity called the writer. And yeah, I know, like the whole vanity thing and pride and whatnot. Oh, you got your characters worshiping you, but that's not entirely the case. It's not even really a style of worship. It's more of a fear. Because people don't typically want to be a part of the writer's plot. The whole thing is that, like, one of the basic fundamentals of this faith of the writer is that the majority of people, in fact, 99.999% of the people on the planet throughout the entirety of the history, from the point of when people began to the point of where they ended, will never be a part of a plot. Mostly due to the sake that there's only so many stories that can be told. Especially in the sake that there's only so many stories that can be told in which the writer himself, or itself in general, will find interesting enough to write about. Everybody has their own little plot lines and plot threads and stuff like that. And, the whole cause and effect, so on and so forth. But for the most part, people don't want to be in a major plot because it becomes detrimental to their lives, to the lives of their family and their friends and their community and all this other stuff. People don't want that. And there are those who will continue to try to not be a plot point. Not that there's anything that they can do about it, but it's kind of a hope and something that a lot of people believe that they can avoid wholeheartedly. And there are a lot of characters and a lot of people in this world whose entire lives, entire existence revolve around being characters. Like Penelope, for example, who I will get to later as well. She is well aware of what's going on. She can't speak with the writer. She can't do anything to influence the writer. But she's well aware that while she's never a main character, she is always a plot point. She's always someone who's there, and she's always kind of aware when she's being a plot point. Like I said, I'll get to Penelope later. Anyway, so because people worship this entity called the writer, it's called the Writerverse for that reason. So even in times where people are not actively worshipping the writer, which is anything before like the 21st century, because the student has to show up and do all this stuff during the Age of Interest. It's still the Writerverse just for that reason alone. So yeah, that's why it's the Writerverse. But let's get on to the interesting stuff within the Writerverse. Not just the why, but everything else. The who and the whats and the wheres. Because that's where things get interesting. So, within the Writerverse, there are 5 primary universal deities. At least 5 known primary universal deities. And that's Solanus, magic, the stars, the planets, and life. Solanus is an interesting character. You see, the gods that we know, for example, Zeus, Yahweh, Ra, Odin, so on and so forth, they are planetary deities. They have no real power outside their respective domain and planet. Solanus is the god that creates these gods. She is the one who breathes them into being after a certain amount of people believe in these gods. And the number's not particularly high. Like, there are a lot of tiny, insignificant gods within every planet. And then you got the major ones who are a part of particular pantheons and religions and so on and so forth. Solanus is the one that creates them. Solanus is also one of these gods that wants to understand things a little bit more. Like, she can create the gods, she knows the beliefs, she knows what's going on there, but she decides at one point that she wants to understand. But because she is a universal deity, she can't actually even set foot on a planet without it erupting into flames. I mean, there's just a certain amount of power there. So basically, she used drops of her own blood, her divine vitae, sent it through time, put it on Earth, and basically, she gets 31 mortal lives. And everyone that she experiences, she learns something more throughout the timeline of the reality of the Writerverse, as well as how humans work, how they think, how everything just comes to pass. And that is something that Solanus desperately and deeply wants to understand. Because let's face it, knowing how belief works is great. Knowing that it works in general is great. But getting down to the fundamentals of how and why people believe what they believe, that is something Solanus really, really wants. Magic is probably one of the more mundane of the 5 of them. Like, he's magic. He creates the magic that takes place within the universe. And he uses Earth kind of as his own central hub, mostly due to the sake that just happened to be the planet that he decided to create his 9 magical races on. And yes, the magical races did not survive. They created a cataclysm that basically erased them from the planet's history, while creating a universal focal point in the process. Another thing that I will get to in just a little bit. There's a lot of stuff that I have to take in stride. But yeah, magic in general is one of those beings that he just likes to do things his own way, and he's fairly inconsistent as to how he wants his magic to be used. So, throughout the history of magic's presence on Earth, at least the power of magic being present on Earth, it tends to change every few hundred years just to try and keep things interesting, to try and keep certain people from becoming too powerful, and so on and so forth. And because he's just plain inconsistent on how he wants things to be used. The sun and the planets, they are probably 2 of my personal favorites of the universal deities. Mostly because they are essentially a wedded couple. They love each other. They can't go on without one another. The stars, for example, wouldn't have much of anything going on if not for the planets. And the planets wouldn't exist without the stars. So they love each other. But they also are split into several different beings. And with all that, they can't really be together. And because they split apart and, there's the planets and all that and the stars and all that, they've managed to create their daughter, Life. And Life is the only universal deity capable of existing on planets. Because, well, she is life. And it just makes sense that and basically anywhere that a living being exists, so does she. Now, she also has her own personal, corporeal form, and she's been known to meet up with people and, grant people gifts and stuff like that. But for the most part, Life is life. She's very kind, she's very understanding, but she also knows that in the end, life has to end as well. And she knows that that of all the universal deities, she is the one who is going to eventually cease to exist. And that gives her a little bit more of a perspective over the entire time frame than, say, the sun and the stars, or Solanus, or even magic for that matter. She is the one who knows she is going to end, and as such, she tries to help those who also know their lives are going to end. So the Writerverse is split into 6 separate eras. There's the Ancient Era. This is an era that humanity itself does not actually remember. This is the era with Magic's 9 created magical races. And yeah, it's almost erased from existence, but it still happened. It's one of those things where it kind of put itself into its own little pocket dimension with a definitive end to it. Then after that, it's BCE, or before Common Era, and that's, your typical ancient humans, before the year 0. After that, you have the Common Era, which is now essentially, so you got from 0 onward until eventually, at least in terms of the Writerverse, until eventually technology stops. If you want to know why it stops, read The Engine That Runs the World, and that sort of explains it. Technology just goes kaput, and all that sort of stuff happens, and magic takes over, and it becomes a whole new thing. It becomes a whole new era, and people, society, all that stuff is completely different than what it was before, when technology was still a thing. But then eventually magic starts to run out. It starts to going real thin. And that's actually because magic as a deity stopped delivering to Earth. And instead created its own source of magic on the planet. But unfortunately, with the entire planet consistently using magic in large quantities, the source is only capable of producing so much magic at a time, and it starts to run thin. This brings in the New Era, and it is actually called the New Era. And this is where you start getting a reconstruction of technology, and people becoming more bold in what they're trying to do with it. So you get a sort of steampunk era, sort of a diesel punk era, and so on, until eventually it does create a very, very real cyberpunk era, or an age of cyberpunk, essentially. And that's when you start getting into the final era. People didn't really start calling it the final era up until right near the end of things, until the end of humanity. And it's the end of humanity. And the final era is essentially like 150 years in total. And then humanity is gone. All living things on the planet are gone, and it allows the Earth to start itself again. Because the Writerverse takes place in a alternate version of Earth, there's a certain amount of history that gets shared between the two. But because the existence of magic and supernatural creatures, and because technology, even in the Common Era, is much greater than what it was beforehand, there's some explanations that have to go on there. And all that said, certain aspects of history are very different. Now, don't get me wrong, like, huge events like, say, World War II still happened. I mean, it started a little earlier in this world, but it still happened. Say something like 9/11 did not happen in this universe. And that comes down to the sake that religion in this world did not really take off to the same extent as it does in this one. You see, because magic does actually exist, there are some explanations, and people were capable of answering and asking the right questions at the right time. Like, monarchs still happen, churches still happen, and stuff like that. Like, religion is still there. Like, even in, say, the Common Era, Christianity is still a huge presence. At least until the Church of the Writer happens, and then Christianity goes into a little bit of a downfall. Also, the war between the gods, that definitely did not do any favors for Christianity. But for the most part, like, it really doesn't matter in that sort of way. Oh yeah, the gods are real in this. So I mean, that also really helped propel things forward. And because gods in a lot of the cases were happy to actually talk to the people that were worshiping them, less stuff got caught in the crosshairs. So concepts like sexism and racism tended to not pick up in the same vein like they did in our world. Religion not being as strong meant stuff like terrorism is not near as rampant. Like, it still exists, but it's not to the same extent. It's not to the same gravitas, the same gravity as our world. Now, don't get me wrong. This world has more than its fair share of problems and issues. They're just not the same issues. Because there are just certain things that just didn't take off as well. Like slavery in the U.S. was not near as big of a thing. And, like, it started off as a thing, but people just kind of were like, yeah, this is not really where we want to go with this. Also because technology continued to march forward way faster than what it did in this one. Slaves were not really needed. So they just kind of got freed. So people just started freeing their own slaves of their own free will, and it just kind of became a cultural thing, even in places where slavery was rampant, much, much sooner. Like, I think in total, slavery might have lasted 20 years, tops, in the Writerverse. Just, at least in the United States. Like, in the ancient times, yeah, slavery was totally a thing. It wasn't anything that was going to go away anytime soon. But in the more modern eras in the last 500 years or so, like, it just wasn't really a thing. People didn't want it to be a thing, so it just wasn't a thing. and women were more than willing and more than happy to take up arms way sooner than what they did. They were definitely way more violent about getting their freedom and their equalities than they were in our time. So people were more willing to just let them have their freedom and equality much easier than they were now. Like, don't get me wrong, like, that sort of thing would not fly today or in this world. But it just kind of happened how it happened. And as such, women have basically racism, sexism, not really major things. Especially come the Common Era, where the supernatural creatures become more out in the open. Speciesism does become a thing, but even then, because racism never really caught on, people being against other species also just didn't catch on to the same extent as it would, say, in our world. And yeah, it's just like, it's that little stuff like that make huge impacts as to how people. I mean, that's why in, say, Supernatural Pizza, the biggest problem is not people being against supernatural creatures. Like, yeah, there is some issues there, but it's not the biggest issue. It's the bureaucracy around the Supernatural Council, which I'll get into actually, like, right now. So, the Supernatural Council. This is a form of government that was created back in the mid-1800s by a hunter and a werewolf to try and find peace between all the supernatural races. And it's governed by 10 different species. A vampire, werewolf, hunter, sorcerer, fairy, zombie, ghost, demon, angel, and something else. I can't remember off the top of my head. Wow. But anyway, there's this whole government going on. And the entire idea was to keep supernatural creatures safe from both humans and each other. Because there is a lot of infighting between the supernatural creatures. Oh, was it gargoyles? No, gargoyles got kicked out. Anyway, there was a lot of infighting. So, what ended up happening was this hunter and this werewolf saw what was going on, was like, no, this is not okay, and started basically their own government dealing with supernatural creatures. And it created a level of peace throughout all of North America because they held by these certain rules. Now, come the modern nights, the message got really, really muddled, especially as the werewolf got old and the hunter kind of stepped back from everything. The messages got muddled, bureaucracy really started to take over, and it became more corrupt than what it should have. And, that's where a lot of the issues in Supernatural Pizza come in. Is because the Supernatural Council's ideals got muddled. But that's not here or there. That's a total thing for if you want to read Supernatural Pizza, you can see what's going on there. What it pretty much comes down to is the Supernatural Council just controls and governs the entirety of the supernatural creatures. There are some that are not entirely represented. Oh, that's what the last one was. It was the new breed. The children. Which is a whole other thing. I'm not going to get to it in this video. They are basically the Supernatural Council. Yeah. You get what they do. I'm going to move on. In almost every book that I write, Red City is either a mention or the central setting of the book. Red City is the city that was built on top of the universal focal point, and which I'm going to get to in the next section. So don't worry about any of that. But Red City, it started off as a settlement called Gatesholm, which eventually got renamed to Red Deer, which only lasted like 20 years or so until it became Red City. And Red City is the central hub for almost everything. It's the primary home of the Supernatural Council. It's the primary home of the Legion of 12. It is the primary home of the superheroes. It's the primary home of everything. And it's because it is on the universal focal point. Again, I'll get to that in the next section. Red City is everything. It's everything. It's got so much going on in it at all times. The best way I can basically describe it is it's almost Ankh-Morpork. Like, it's not a good city. It is not a good place. And it is not particularly run by good people. But it's run by a certain level of competence that allows it not only to run, but become one of the greatest cities in all of North America. And in and of itself, it's not even really technically a part of Canada. Like, it runs by Canadian law. It runs by Canadian rule. It uses Canadian currency, and it allows itself to be taxed by both the province of Alberta and the government of Canada, in the way that it is basically a Canadian city, but it's not technically a Canadian city. It is its own independent city-state that is allowed to run and remain independent on the condition that it treats itself like it is a Canadian city. And eventually, when Alberta secedes from Canada and and a whole bunch of stuff goes on, Red City then solidifies itself as its own independent place. It is not a part of Alberta as a country. It was willing to play ball as Canada, but once Alberta decided to split off, it completely shut itself off from it as well. And yeah, that's basically Red City in and of itself. I'm going to get into the universal focal point now. So when the creatures of magic erased themselves from history, it created a universal focal point, which is a point within the universe in which everything interesting focuses on. This is why the Supernatural Council set up shop here. This is why the Legion of 12 grew to become what they are. This is why the superhuman movement began in Red City. It is because it must hold all that is interesting and almost be the start of what changes the world in and of itself. Everything, all world-changing ideals, all world-changing events, all either started in Red City or have roots to Red City. This includes magic running thin. This includes technology going bye-bye. This includes everything in and of itself. Like, yes, there are interesting events that happen in other countries, and there are things that will shake the world in other countries. But the roots there will always be a root or a line that starts with Red City because of the universal focal point. Had that not happened, had the universal focal point never been a thing, then there's a very good chance that this world would look actually much more like our world, for example, and there would be way more world-changing technologies that take place in other parts of the world. A lot of what goes on on this version of Earth relies on Red City. And that is because of this universal focal point. The Legion of 12 is a collection of corporations that began in the late 1800s, some of them actually having roots down to the mid-1800s, and basically heading most, if not all, basic industries. And it consists of hermetic pharmaceuticals, which takes over the medical industry, deep dirt agriculture, which is the agriculture industry, big dog contracting, which is buildings, the Ares Corporation, which is a big funder and supplier to everything having to do with the military, law enforcement, and anything dealing with that, including security and all that other stuff. Haven Temple is basically works around religion and kind of controls where religion goes and how it functions within society. Religion is no longer allowed to run rampant with the Legion of 12 in charge because, well, religion is basically a form of control, and the Legion does not want that. Social Technologies deals with technology in terms of computers, in terms of basic advancements, and it's not a competitor with anybody in the Legion of 12, and they actively do help out with the Legion of 12 in terms of their own personal technologies. Social Technologies also has a lot of their own personal secrets. Bacchus Publishing deals with books. The Two Wings Foundation basically ensures that all charities that they have ties with are honest. They deal with charities and make sure that they're honest, that the money that people donate go to where they're supposed to go to, and just helps along with everything else having to do with charities and keeping in everything going on. Motion Motors is vehicles. Payday Banking is banking. Unstoppable Energy deals with the energy sector and makes sure that everything is running smoothly and that basically everything is running greenly, because, well, the entirety of the Legion of 12 agrees that the environment is one of the first and foremost things that needs to be taken care of. And then the final one is Ghost Doll Productions, and they deal with movies, music, and basically music, movies, television, anything that has any sort of real production value to them. And while they have fingers in a whole bunch of other different industries, that is their primary sources. The Legion of 12 is something that I would almost refer to as the ultimates in capitalism. Not in that they, try and take over everything and try and rule everything, but because they believe in absolutes in terms of competition. They want to help out the small business because they understand and know that small businesses are where a good chunk of the economy comes from. So they actively help out small businesses without just buying them outright. They'll actively donate. They will advertise for them. They will do everything they can to help small businesses out. Like I said before, they believe the environment is something that needs to be protected and will do everything in their power to try and protect the environment. The Legion of 12 are not evil corporations. They are actually good. I mean, don't get me wrong, they also are very, very much corporations, and they do look out for their bottom line, but they're flexible on how they get to their bottom line, so long as it's not done immorally. And that is one of the biggest things with the Legion of 12 is morality. They want to ensure that technology and society are able to progress in a very moral standard. That's essentially the Legion of 12 in a nutshell. Like, there's way, 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 way more to it than that, but that's the sort of stuff that I get to in books, not on a YouTube video. The student is a superhuman with the ability to basically do anything that he sees somebody else do. And he's kind of like Taskmaster in a sort of way, but it also works with powers and abilities, not just, fighting styles. So if he sees someone throw a fireball, he's able to throw a fireball. If he sees somebody crossing the dimensional line, then he himself is capable of crossing the dimensional line. The student very quickly, actually, became one of the most, if not the most powerful being in the Writerverse. He's only one step down from being a universal god. And the only reason he's not a universal god is because I myself, as the writer, am not willing to give him that level of power. And because the universal gods are unwilling to even show up in his presence. They know who he is, they know what he's capable of, they don't want anything to do with him. The only ones that have witnessed him are the sun and the stars, and he is capable of becoming a planet or a star. The student knows that that's all he would ever be at that point, because he would be changing his entire personal composition. And the student has an understanding that because he's at a certain level of power, anything that he does within the Writerverse will create a ripple effect that could change the entire course of causality and time, and as such is very, very, very unwilling to take part in anything past giving a hint of advice here and there to somebody. And yeah, that's basically the student. The student is also, as I stated before, the start of the writer religion. Because of his powers and abilities, nobody is willing to say, yeah, no, you're making this up. With who he is and what he's capable of, people believe what he says and what he'd written down. So this video is starting to get really long. There's still so much more that I could talk about with this world. Like Penelope, the superheroes, and stuff like that, but I don't know. If people want to hear more, then I'll get into more about it, but I'm already past the half-an-hour mark, so I'm just gonna basically wrap this up in my own sort of way. The books, in general, are the canon, and everything that I've mentioned throughout this is non-canon in its own way. Until it is put in a physical book, it is not considered absolute canon. Now, this is everything that I've mentioned in this is how I myself view the Writerverse. And it's the sort of canon that I am going to try and stick to throughout the Writerverse. But my mind can change sometimes. And if it creates a better story, then that's what I'm going to work with. Now, I plan to do 100 books before I die. 100 books with my name on it to create the Writerverse. And I also kind of want to bring in the possibility of other writers writing within this world. And while I'm definitely not ready for that yet, the time might come when I start asking people, hey, would you like to contribute to this world? And when I do, there will be 3 major rules. Don't fuck with canon. Should be pretty self-evident. Don't use previously existing characters. Basically, any character that I have created or any other author that has written into this world creates, you cannot use those characters. You have to use your own. And make it interesting. But like I said, I'm not ready for that just yet. It'll be quite some time before I am ready to ask other authors to contribute to this world. But when I do, it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Actually, I do have one author who is writing something, but her and I had started off writing a book together in this world, and we just sort of decided to do companion books. So she is officially a writer within this world. It just has to be a finished. They're just not a finished book to show for it just yet. Hopefully soonish, but I'm not rushing her by any means. And yeah. Anyway, that is all I'm going to be going on about with the Writerverse in this video. Like I said, this has gone on really long. I'm pushing 40 minutes now. So yeah. Have a good day, folks.